On behalf of the friends and family of Nisei veterans, we are proud to continue our presentations on Japanese Americans who served in the armed forces during World War II. Although most Americans may have known very little about the Japanese American soldiers of World War II, the accomplishments of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the 100th Infantry Battalion is legendary among historians and military experts. Yet the efforts of a special group of Japanese Americans remain largely unknown and purposely hidden from the public eye until well after the end of World War II. This group was the Military Intelligence Service, or MIS. Because of the highly classified and secret nature of their missions, knowledge of the work of many MIS soldiers was largely missing during the war. Not until 1972 was the role of the MIS finally brought to light as its stories and experiences were revealed to the general public when President Richard Nixon signed Executive Order 11652 declassifying all World War II military intelligence documents. However, the importance of the work performed by the MIS was known to the President of the United States and to the General of the Army, with the most significant acknowledgement of the work of the MIS being expressed by Major General Charles Willoughby. The history of the MIS starts before the United States entry into World War II. In the spring of 1941, war against Japan seemed imminent. Military leaders realized early on the importance of having Army personnel skilled in the Japanese language as translators and interrogators. A group of officers with previous tours of duty in Japan recognized the complexity of the Japanese language and recognized the need for an intelligence unit able to comprehend not only the spoken Japanese language, but the intricacies of military terminology. The possibility of using Japanese Americans with language skills was suggested as the number of Caucasian personnel qualified in Japanese was almost non-existent, and there was little time to train additional Caucasian personnel. This view was shared by Japanese military leaders, who firmly believed that its language was too complex for any foreigner to comprehend. Its leaders therefore thought that their battle plans were perfectly safe from opponents and did not need a special code to remain secret. Japan neglected to consider that some Japanese Americans had learned the language or had been educated in Japan. The MIS included second-generation Japanese Americans, or Nisei, who were specifically recruited for their linguistic ability. Although subject to distrust throughout the war, the MIS Nisei were eventually recognized as invaluable to every group in the Pacific. Their jobs were often dangerous and made more difficult by their ambivalent position within the armed forces. Like other Americans of Japanese descent, the MIS Nisei were the objects of suspicion and fear. Like other Nisei soldiers, they had to work doubly hard to prove their loyalty as Americans. But perhaps even more so than any other Nisei soldier, the MIS linguist occupied a contradictory space within the war. Within the MIS organization itself, the Nisei were responsible for highly classified information, yet they themselves were constantly subjected to intense scrutiny. They were almost always accompanied or led by a Caucasian officer. In all, 6,000 men served in the MIS. Trained as interrogators, interpreters, translators, radio announcers, and propaganda writers, the MIS Nisei came to be considered the eyes and ears of American and Allied forces in the war against Japan. According to one MIS veteran, "We may have been the only soldiers in history to have bodyguards to protect us from our own forces in combat zones, so we would not be mistaken for the enemy. More than one MIS soldier became a casualty from friendly fire, and many MIS personnel had to ensure that Caucasian soldiers who could vouch for their loyalty accompanied them into battle. The MIS Nisei served confidentially, working as individuals or in small units, assigned to combat divisions in many of the campaigns in the Pacific. They served not only with the U.S. Armed Forces, but also with other Allied armed forces, including those of Australia, Canada, China, Great Britain, India, and New Zealand. The story of the MIS includes an important subset of Nisei, the Kibei. Kibei was a term often used to describe Japanese Americans born in the United States who returned to America after receiving their education in Japan. Some Japanese Americans sent their children, many of whom had dual citizenship, back to Japan so the children were educated in Japanese school systems and maintained the Japanese language as well as Japanese cultural traditions. Another reason was the strong anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States, and these parents worried that they might be deported back to Japan. As a result, they sent their children to Japan so they could survive either in the United States or Japan. When in Japan, the Kibei lived with grandparents or other relatives, while their parents remained in the United States to work. Kibei often struggled to fit in both in Japan, where they were viewed as outsiders, and in the United States, where they were considered too Japanese by their Nisei peers. Because of their knowledge of both cultures and languages, the Kibei in particular were targeted by the government as disloyal during World War II. Ironically, the Kibei were heavily recruited for the MIS because of their linguistic abilities. While the exact number is not known, it is said there were about 10,000 Kibei Nisei Japanese Americans. Besides the constant danger of friendly fire, the Kibei were well aware that Japanese imperial forces considered them to be Japanese nationals, and capture meant certain execution as traitors. These identities doubled the dangers they faced in battle from both Japanese and American soldiers, both of whom perceived them as the enemy. The Kibei who operated in the Pacific were confronted by the very real possibility of encountering and fighting against friends, acquaintances, and family members. Many of them had close personal ties to Japan since they had been educated in Japan. Throughout the war, many had unexpected meetings and spontaneous reunions with former teachers, classmates, and family members, emphasizing the complicated and personal nature of the war for the men of the MIS, particularly as combat came closer to Japan. The MIS started with the creation of the MIS Language School, which would be the first school for foreign language and combat intelligence training for the War Department. The MIS Language School began at the Presidio in San Francisco in November of 1941, about a month before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The students were grouped according to their proficiency in Japanese and English. On weekdays, they went to class from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., exercised and drilled, ate supper, and returned to class from 7 to 9 in the evening. On Saturdays, the students were tested on all of the material that had been covered in the preceding week. After lights out on Fridays, it was hard to find an empty stall in the latrine, as the more conscientious students stayed up late to study. For the officers in charge of the school and their Nisei students, the outbreak of war prompted their studies to intensify to prove their loyalty. Military security officers questioned the loyalty of the Nisei students, removing some due to suspicion, and prompting language student leaders to recognize that frontline commanders would have difficulty entrusting the Nisei soldiers with sensitive documents, and sought to find Caucasian officers with Japanese proficiency to serve as team leaders. 2 men graduated with the first class, Captain David Swift and Captain John Burden, both born in Japan as the sons of missionaries, and even spoke the Tokyo dialect better than some of the Nisei students. Of the first class of 60 students who began their training at the Presidio, 45 graduated in May of 1942. In the weeks prior to graduation, most, if not all, of the graduating Nisei families were hurriedly preparing for relocation to internment camps, selling their personal belongings and settling their business matters, which would take place a few days after the small graduation ceremony. At its peak in 1946, the MIS Language School had 160 instructors and 3,000 students studying in more than 125 classrooms. The 21st and final commencement in June 1946 featured the graduation of 307 students, bringing the total number of MIS Language School graduates to more than 6,000. After starting at the Presidio in San Francisco, the MIS Language School was moved to Camp Savage, Minnesota in June 1942, offering larger facilities without the complications of training Japanese American students in the coastal areas they were prohibited from. In August 1944, the language school outgrew Camp Savage and moved to Fort Snelling, Minnesota. In 1946, the school moved to the Presidio in Monterey and eventually became the Defense Language Institute, which expanded rapidly in 1947-1948 during the Cold War. Instructors, including native speakers of more than 30 languages and dialects, were recruited from all over the world. Russian became the largest language program, followed by Chinese, Korean, and German. As the first language school class completed its training in May of 1942, its students were immediately sent to the front lines. At first, commanders were skeptical of the Nisei linguists. The first unit of MIS Nisei were deployed under the command of Captain John Burden. Upon arrival, Burden and his Nisei predictably found themselves assigned to menial tasks, translating non-sensitive personal letters far from the front due to the lack of trust. However, naval commanders found that the Caucasian interpreters only had a rudimentary understanding of Japanese and could only decipher the names of its prisoners. Burden convinced naval commanders to give the Nisei linguists a chance. The Nisei linguists worked hard to prove themselves. Nisei in New Caledonia worked around the clock to translate a captured list of call signs and code names of all Imperial Japanese Navy ships and air bases. Captain Burden and the Nisei pushed to get closer to the action, and some wound up on Guadalcanal, where they made a big discovery: the Joint Operational Plan for Japanese Forces in the South Pacific. Burden demonstrated the wealth of information that could be provided by a fully fluent linguist and vouched for the Japanese soldiers in his command to meet the demand. His presence proved to be instrumental in opening the eyes of the American field commanders to the value of the Nisei linguists. MIS Nisei would be present at every major battle against Japanese forces in the Pacific, and those who served in combat faced extremely dangerous and difficult conditions, facing prejudice from soldiers who believed they couldn't be trusted, sometimes coming under friendly fire from U.S. soldiers unable to distinguish them from the Japanese, and even dealing with a psychological conflict of encountering former friends and family on the battlefield. In the Solomons and in New Guinea, MIS Nisei linguists learned that humane treatment and sympathetic interrogation of Japanese prisoners yielded far more information than harsh interrogation, that scanning documents quickly produced better and more timely tactical information than translating each document word for word. Nisei intelligence specialists at General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Australia translated a prize that had been found in a Japanese lifeboat following the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. A comprehensive roster of all of the Imperial Japanese Army's officers. Teams in Australia and in Washington, D.C. indexed and cross-referenced the list throughout the war, giving U.S. commanders a wealth of information about the units they faced. MIS Nisei linguists in MacArthur's command also translated Japan's Z Plan for defending the Marianas and the Philippines. The Z Plan had fallen into American hands after a fatal plane crash. The plan had been devised by Mineichi Koga, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese fleet. The plan included details on all Japanese naval forces and their assignments, valuable information that was closely sheltered until Koga's plane crashed in a typhoon over the Philippines. The plans made their way into American hands through Filipino guerrillas. The information led to an overwhelming U.S. victory in the June 1944 Battle of the Philippine Sea, which eliminated the Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to conduct large-scale carrier actions. The aerial part of the battle was called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for the heavy losses inflicted on Japanese aircraft by American pilots and anti-aircraft gunners. These actions were not the only time Nisei translators played a crucial role in translating battle plans that found their way into Americans' hands. They worked by flashlight in the middle of the night to translate battle plans that ended up helping American forces win the Battle of Saipan, help stave off assaults in Burma, and even help with the war in Europe by translating communications between Japan's ambassador to Germany and Tokyo. They participated in every major campaign against Japan, often doing much more than translating as they engaged in active combat. Another major MIS Nisei contribution was the ambush in April 1943 of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined Japanese fleet and the mastermind of the attack on Pearl Harbor. MIS Sergeant Harold Fudena intercepted a radio message indicating the whereabouts of Admiral Yamamoto, who planned an inspection tour in the Bougainville area. Fudena, assigned to a radio intelligence unit, translated at least one message and confirmed that the U.S. fighters sent to intercept Yamamoto were not heading into a trap. As a result, P-38 Lightning fighter planes shot down Admiral Yamamoto's plane over the Solomon Islands. Although this message was first met with disbelief that the Japanese would be so careless, other MIS Nisei linguists in Alaska and Hawaii had also intercepted the same message, confirming its accuracy. The success of these first few Nisei linguists convinced the War Department to establish more Japanese-American combat units, such as the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, employed to the European theater. In January 1944, 14 MIS Nisei linguists were assigned to a unit innocuously named the 5307 Composite Provisional Unit. The unit was organized to conduct long-range penetration, special operations, jungle warfare, deep behind Japanese line in the China-Burma Indian Theater. The group became known as Merrill's Marauders for the unit's commanding officer, Brigadier General Frank Merrill. The Nisei, under Merrill's command, proved themselves particularly intrepid and helpful, venturing into the enemy lines with reconnaissance patrols, listening for information dropped by the Japanese, who conversed loudly, secure in their mistaken belief that the Americans could not understand a word of their conversations. The Nisei would translate audible commands to counterattacks and shout conflicting commands to the Japanese, throwing them into confusion. The MIS Nisei and Merrill's Marauders soon became the best-known Nisei in the war against Japan. The War Relocation Authority used their story to impress other Americans with Nisei valor and loyalty, even placing stories in local newspapers as the war waned in 1945, and the War Relocation Authority prepared to release Japanese American citizens back into their communities. General Merrill, who ordered the other Marauders to protect the Nisei linguists with their lives, would later say, "As for the value of the Nisei, I couldn't have gotten along without them." Along with the group achievements enjoyed by the MIS Nisei, other individual efforts stand out. One of those efforts was displayed by Bob Kubo, who earned the Distinguished Service Cross, America's second highest award for heroism, while serving with the 27th Infantry Division in Saipan. The island had been secured after heavy combat, but many enemy holdouts remained at large. Kubo entered a cliffside cave alone to face a group of desperate Japanese soldiers who were holding more than 100 civilians captive. Over the next 2 hours, Kubo shared his rations with the enemy soldiers and conversed with them. He told them that his grandfathers had served in Japan's elite 5th and 6th Divisions in the Russo-Japanese War. Kubo said his parents were Japanese, just like theirs, but his country was America and theirs was Japan. He quoted a classic Japanese proverb to explain that he owed his higher loyalty to his country. In the end, the civilians were released, and 9 Japanese soldiers surrendered. Another story worth mentioning is the story of Sergeant Frank Hachiya. In December 1944, the Oregon native was tasked with interrogating a prisoner captured during the Battle of Leyte. On his way back to his headquarters to report the intelligence gained, Hachiya was shot in the abdomen and crawled, bleeding and in agony, through the grass and scrub back to his lines to make his report. Despite the best efforts of the field surgeons, he eventually succumbed to his wounds, but not before passing on the intelligence he acquired. The account of his death was widely reported in national news, contrasting sharply with the news that the local American Legion post in his hometown of Hood River, Oregon, had removed the names of 16 World War I Japanese American veterans from its roll of honor only a month before. Scathing editorials in the Oregonian and the New York Times eventually caused the Post to reverse its course, restoring all the names of Nisei servicemen from Hood River to the wall, and adding the name of Frank Hachiya. The surrender of Imperial Japan was announced by Japanese Emperor Hirohito on August 15, 1945. However, the work of the MIS Nisei did not end. 6 MIS Nisei were deployed with small teams to parachute into Japanese prisoner of war camps to protect thousands of Allied POWs from retribution. On August 17, 1945, an MIS linguist jumped into the camp at Pei Ping with 6 other Americans, bearing food, medicine, and other supplies for the POWs there. Upon landing, they were surrounded by armed Japanese troops. After convincing the commander that Japan had surrendered, the GIs liberated more than 600 Allied prisoners, including 4 survivors of the April 1942 Doolittle Tokyo raid. Also, on August 17th, another team freed Wei Shen prison camp. On August 27th, another team dropped onto Hainan Island, again to a potentially deadly reception. By September 1945, the MIS Nisei had translated 18,000 captured enemy documents, printed 16,000 propaganda leaflets, and interrogated more than 10,000 Japanese prisoners of war. These men faced some of the most dangerous situations during the war, often being placed on the front lines of battle against the Japanese, while simultaneously trying to avoid friendly fire from American soldiers who could not distinguish them from enemy Japanese. On September 2, 1945, three MIS Nisei were aboard the USS Missouri for the formal signing of the surrender documents. That ceremony triggered similar ceremonies across Asia and the Pacific as Japanese troops laid down their arms and surrendered to American and Allied commanders. Many of the isolated Japanese garrisons had to be convinced to surrender. MIS Nisei did much of the convincing. One MIS Nisei was at the September 16, 1945 surrender of Japanese in Hong Kong to the British. One of his kid brothers, who had returned to Japan with the family before the war, was translating for the Japanese government that day. They recognized each other, but dared not say a word for fear of disrupting the ceremony. Over 5,000 Japanese Americans served in the occupation of Japan. During the occupation, Nisei members of the MIS addressed issues related to public welfare and the rebuilding of Japanese cities. The MIS contributed in the creation of the Constitution of Japan, creating the Japanese National Police Reserve and the subsequent Defense Agency. MIS Nisei would be awarded the Order of the Rising Sun by the Japanese government for their efforts. Nisei interpreters worked closely in restoring Japanese cities, in addition to issues related to public welfare and the rebuilding of cities. They were also responsible for the demobilization of Japanese military personnel from various overseas ports. Another important concern for American forces was the arrest and prosecution of Japan's military leaders, a task which involved the Nisei personnel. Many Nisei participated in the prosecution of the individuals held in Sugamo prison during the war trials that began in 1945 and lasted until 1948. MIS Nisei linguists provided translation services for the war crimes tribunals and served as the interpreters for the trials held in Japan, China, the Philippines, French Indochina, and the East Indies. In addition to working closely with Japanese and Japanese officials, many Nisei officers were assigned as language aides and cultural liaisons to key general headquarters officers. The story of the MIS is not complete, however, without highlighting the role of Japanese American women who served in the MIS. By the time the war ended, nearly 500 Japanese American women had served in the United States military. 48 Japanese American women serving in the Women's Army Corps, or WACS, were assigned to the Military Intelligence Service Language School. In keeping with the policy of non-combat roles for women, they were trained separately from the men in document translation only. In addition, the students learned about Japan's history, geography, military structure, political, and cultural background. Classes were held from morning until late afternoon, with a 2-hour mandatory study hall after dinner. Some women continued studying in their rooms until lights out at 10 p.m., and those who were really struggling managed to study secretly after that in their rooms or the showers until the early morning hours. Life at the MIS language school was not all drudgery. The women had access to more Japanese food than they had ever had in their lives. They had time off to sightsee and attend concerts and museums, or go fishing in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area. They often used their furloughs to travel freely in the East, or visit their friends and families who were living in internment camps. And with a lopsided ratio of more than 50 men to each woman, they had plenty of social opportunities. After graduation, a few of the top graduating women taught briefly at the MIS language school, but most were assigned to the Pacific Military Intelligence Research Section at Camp Ritchie, Maryland. There they worked with captured Japanese documents, translating military plans, and political and economic information that affected Japan's war capabilities. At the end of the war, 11 Japanese American WACs, along with 1 Chinese American and 1 Caucasian, accepted assignments in Tokyo, Japan under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. As part of the Army of Occupation, the Nisei WAC's job was to work with captured documents as well as help build relations with the Japanese. But as soon as they arrived in Tokyo, they learned that General MacArthur did not approve of enlisted women serving overseas. He ordered them to return to the United States as WACs or serve one-year contracts in Japan as civilians with the Civil Intelligence Service. All of the Nisei women remained in Japan as civil servants. In this capacity, the women noted that they received much better pay as civilians than they did as members of the military. But while they translated documents to be used in the war crimes trials, living in war-ravaged Japan was a jarring experience. The women saw the destitute situation in which people were living in the subways and scrounging for food in garbage cans, and saw many orphans who were trying to survive in any way that they could. In spite of these horrific conditions for the Japanese, all the women performed their work honorably. The efforts of the MIS Nisei resulted in many individual honors from the United States, along with various medals from the foreign governments they assisted. 9 Nisei members of the MIS have been inducted into the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. 3 Nisei members assigned to Merrill's Marauders have been inducted into the Army Rangers Hall of Fame. The Defense Language Institute at the Presidio of Monterey dedicated Nisei Hall in honor of the Japanese Americans who served in the MIS. Additionally, longtime civilian MIS language school instructor Shigeaki Hara was inducted into the Defense Language Institute Hall of Fame in its inaugural year of 2006. The following year, MIS language school graduates Colonel Thomas Sakamoto and Major Masaji Jin Uratsu were inducted. In April 2000, more than 50 years after World War II ended, the Military Intelligence Service became the recipient of the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor given to a U.S. military unit. On October 5th of 2010, Congress approved the granting of the Congressional Gold Medal to the 6,000 Japanese Americans who served in the MIS during the war, as well as the Japanese American 442nd Regimental Combat Team and 100th Infantry Battalion. Also noteworthy is that one MIS Nisei, Arthur Ishimoto, attained the highest rank of any Nisei World War II veteran, rising to Air Force Major General and head of the Hawaii National Guard. And George Ariyoshi, an MIS Nisei who was drafted near the war's end and served in the occupation of Japan, would become America's first Asian governor and Hawaii's longest-serving governor, serving from 1974 to 1986. If you wish to learn more about the MIS, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the Japanese American experience during World War II, please visit our exhibit on the USS Hornet Museum, located at Pier 3 in Alameda, California. And visit our website at ffmv.org. Thank you very much.